Ready?
Ready.
3, 2, 1.
This is The Jungle, an up-close, unvarnished look inside leadership and business strategy. We wade into the real-world leader's face and explore what they do to create a path forward, because that's what business is. Wild, exciting.
It's The Jungle.
Welcome to the podcast again, Derrick. Welcome to The Jungle.
Jungle's real, Doug. Jungle is getting worse by the day right now.
It was snowing outside today, Derrick. Mid-April here in Michigan, it was snowing. Do you get some flakes over by you?
I did indeed. Good.
I'm really glad that we have these nice, cozy Patagonias on right now. We ordered these. This is like my go-to. It's like my work uniform almost right now. So the podcast, you're going to see this every day because it's the uniform.
It's perfect for Michigan or Canadian weather. I'll give my Canadian roots a little shout out there.
There you go.
There we go.
So we had a fantastic conversation last week with John Bryant, and I'd love to kind of introduce him before we talk about some takeaways that we had from that conversation. John's been an incredible supporter of our program here in the Leadership and Business Strategy program. He's personally mentored our students. Just a generous guy, responsive, engaging, empathetic, just a really fantastic person. John's got an unbelievable background. So he's got his MBA from Wharton. He spent 20 years of his career with Kellogg's, and 7 of those years he was CEO. Previously, he was CFO, and now he serves on a number of really important boards, including Macy's, Godiva, Compass, and the Ball Corporation. I know he mentioned that we were getting coffee the other day, I think, mentioned that he might have joined another board, so we might be missing something there. But he is really active still, and just a great leader, a great experience across CPG, retail, and I think really brings a great perspective for the podcast, Derrick.
Just he's a great advisor. I think he's doing some investing now too. He's been just phenomenal to both you and I, and to our students, and to Western Michigan University, the Kalamazoo community. Really, really helpful, supporting, mentoring guy. And the conversations are always very, very high level, intellectual, strategic. So super excited.
It's the kind of guy that you just want to, we've gotten coffee with John a couple times at Water Street, and it's just like, look forward to those conversations, because it's going to be, 30, 45 minutes of, you're going to walk out of that conversation saying, that's a good insight. I see things differently. I got a path forward. He always frames things up really nicely.
Great.
So what were your takeaways from our great conversation there, Derrick?
So, great conversation with him. I'm going to start with one easy takeaway, one lighthearted, and 2 really serious ones. So the easy takeaway is John Bryant informed us that he has a video conference shirt that he uses to put on, and he puts it on for video conferences. So I actually put one in my closet right beside me here. Don't have it on right now, but I should have. But I implemented that policy myself. So video conference shirt, have it handy.
Boom.
Boom. That was for his board meetings. He puts his board video conference shirt on, he has his meeting, and then he takes it off. The other thing, now some serious ones, his view into the financial world and liquidity of public and private companies is probably at the top with his background, and the real damage being done to balance sheets right now that he spoke to was scary. That is scary for sure. And that kind of goes into my follow-on. My last takeaway is that this crisis is different. The damage being done is different. Everybody's focused purely on cash flow statements right now, and only cash flow. They're not really looking at the other statements as much. And that most companies plan all of their budgeting, balance sheets, financial statements based on normalcy, not for crisis. So we may see some of that going forward, not for normal steady state operations, but for more downside planning if more of these pandemics are to come with what he is referring to as the globalization that we're in. So fascinating to listen to him talk about some of the ways that they're approaching things. What did you have, Doug? What were your takeaways?
I'm going to go with the 3 C's here today, Derrick.
Oh, 3 C's.
Three C's. All right. So number 1 was communication. start with that one. I loved his framing around this, speaking previously as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, that if you feel like you're almost getting sick of communicating, you're maybe just communicating enough when it comes to crisis. People's need for communication and understanding gets exponentially higher during crisis because things are unsettled and uncertain. And so you can't communicate enough as a leader. And he talked about being able to maximize all the mediums that are available. That could be email, that can be pre-tape video as an executive, that can be social media, that can be text. That's a lot of way of engaging your employees to make sure they have a clear understanding of what's going on with the company. The second one, leadership related, was a sense of calm. I think that was his answer to one of your questions around, what is a kind of a board member, how would he want to be remembered as a board member and as a leader during this time, and this sense of calm. And there is a lot of anxiety and stress out there right now of how companies are going to proceed, layoffs, furloughs, and projecting that calm, even though maybe on the inside you don't feel that way, is really important to make sure there's someone with a steady hand guiding the ship. Third C I took away was around change, and I really liked the way how he thought about this crisis and how it will impact changing different sectors. So his thought is this pandemic will accelerate changes that are already here. The future is here. Whatever has been going on, we're going to see more of. So online education has been here. We should see that maybe accelerating into the future. Things around e-commerce, we might be seeing some more of that into the future. So those are the 3 C's: calm, communication, and change.
Very, very good takeaways. What a great conversation we had with him, and hope everyone enjoys this going forward, because it's a great one to listen to.
So with that, please enjoy our conversation with John Bryant. John Bryant, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
So, John, tell us a little bit about the room that you're in. We're assuming you're at home. Is this like the secret location, or what's your room here?
It is. So I am at home, but my home is very busy right now because I have 10 people in the house.
Wow.
All of my kids have come home, and I have 4 people working full time. I have a McKinsey consultant, Accenture consultant, PwC consultant, and I've got a guy who's just done a startup helping connect entrepreneurs around the world, all 4 working out of this house. So normally I have a beautiful wood paneled office. I've been kicked out of that. I'm doing this podcast from the top corner of my house where some of the kids' bedrooms are. And that's why it's a bit dark behind me. So it's my first time up here, but relatively quiet part of the house.
So you got some serious brain power there with you.
I do, and it gets converted into a game of Catan every now and again, or a game of cards, which I have not won any of those things yet. So clearly much better at it than I am.
Excellent. Well, let's do a little cheers here. Cheers to the podcast, John. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers.
What do you have coffee today? Tea?
Coffee, absolutely.
What are you drinking today, Derrick? You got tea or you got coffee?
I'm back on coffee. I'm trying to do the tea thing, but I'm back on coffee, unfortunately.
A little too much kid time there, Derrick.
Not enough kid time.
Not enough kid time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, John, do you have any new with this wonderful situation we find ourselves in? Do you have any new habits or routines that you're exploring now that you're quarantined? We're all quarantined here at home.
It is amazing. We're talking before about Zoom, and this is my first time actually using Zoom. But this is my video conference shirt. So I put this on to do a video conference. I take it off. Obviously, you normally wouldn't do that. So just strange little things like that you get used to doing. But it's definitely different. A lot more board calls, a lot more frequency of board meetings. The world has definitely changed, but whether you're quarantined or not, I'm not sure that makes that much of a difference.
I did the same thing. I did a little change to the dress, got to comb. Derrick's hair is all combed right now. It wasn't combed, I can tell you that, about 15 minutes ago. So what are these? So, let's dive in a little bit on, what you're doing lots of board calls, probably more obviously than you're used to experiencing. Can you walk us into what your experience is like right now as a board member of these companies during this crisis? Like, walk us into a little bit of what's going on.
Well, most boards meet 4 or 5 times, maybe 6 times a year, so every 2 to 3 months. But with this crisis, the frequency now is weekly phone calls, and even a message from the CEO in email or writing every couple of days. So the frequency is much more significant, and the nature of the decisions being made are far more significant. And so it really is all hands on as companies try to navigate an incredibly difficult environment.
What so you're getting on a weekly basis having these decisions, and as a board member, how do you seeing your role during this crisis as a board member?
Well, if you think about most companies with a board, each year we approve a budget, and then management manages within that budget. So all of their expenses, their major capital plans are all approved. With this crisis, that budget is no longer relevant, and they're having to spend money in different ways or spend a lot less money as they shut down on the revenue side of the equation. The result of that is it's not business as usual, and so you need more board resolutions, but also you need the board to come along with you on the journey so you don't surprise the board. So there's an element of information sharing. There's an element of making decisions, such as drawing down on credit facilities to protect liquidity. All of these things things that boards have to be actively engaged with.
Let's zoom out and then we'll zoom back into the board, your kind of role there and some of the challenges you're thinking about. But let's step way back and talk a little bit about how are you framing up this crisis in terms of how are you seeing it similar, different from previous crises, previous downturns? You've ran a big company during a previous one. How do you think about this?
Yeah, this one is very different. If you think about the 3 big crises we've had over the last 20 years, we had 9/11, we had the Great Recession, and now we have the pandemic. They're all very different to each other. 9/11, there's an element of similarity in that the country was under attack. There was a coming together of people, solidarity. But the solution there was to get people to go out and continue their normal behavior, and that was the best way to combat terrorism. This is very different to that. The Great Recession was really an issue in the financial markets, and it was the financial expression of the value of real assets. So a mortgage-backed security is only worth what the underlying housing is worth and what's the underlying real asset actually worth. This crisis is completely different. This is a shutdown in large parts of the economy, and it's the destruction of real assets that the financial markets are trying to work out what they're actually worth now. And so if you're running an airline, if you're running a hotel, hospitality, stadiums, whatever it is, you've literally been put out of business. And that is catastrophic. And the way to think about that from a mathematic perspective is if you have a business that has, say, $10 billion in sales and you make $2 billion of profits, you have $8 billion of expenses. When you stop the revenue side, some cost items will automatically stop because cost of goods will no longer happen. But that might be, of your $8 billion of expenses, that might be $3 or $4 billion. There's still another $4 or $5 billion of expenses that are going out the door every day. And very few companies have a balance sheet that's able to sustain massive cash outflows for any period of time. And so what you're seeing here is a major liquidity crunch on companies that have essentially been forced to stop trading. And that's why you're seeing these credit facilities get drawn down and really tough decisions being made, such as furloughing employees and managing some of the discretionary costs like CapEx in the very short term.
So we put this podcast together to help other people out. Can you, you mentioned there's rapid decisions being made that are very, very critical, that are being made weekly right now, even faster for some companies. Can you kind of highlight from a board level the decision-making frameworks, tools, anything you guys are using that are being really helpful? Your scenario planning, is it A, B, and C? That's 1 month pandemic, 3 month, 8 month pandemic, just so people can get some insight into, some of the best practices you guys are using or anything you guys are using.
No, absolutely. Now, unfortunately, it's very hard to forecast in this environment. And so it's a very a range of scenarios to your point. And the scenarios include we come back relatively quickly. The more likely one, I think, is we are in lockdown through the end of April and early May, and then the recovery is slow. It's a V shape from where we are, but it doesn't get back to where we were for a very long period of time. And there's a whole series of factors in that. So as a company, you need to think about, okay, I have to survive the period of time that we're in lockdown. And then when we come out of that, I need to have the right sized expense base to support what will be a lower revenue coming in for a number of years. Because even if we overcome the virus in the short term, until we have broad-based immunity across the population, it's going to keep coming back. And so I think we're going to continue to have issues with public settings until we have that broad population-based or herd-based immunity, as some people call it. And so I think it's going to be a very difficult period of time. This is not just we come out of lockdown and we're back to where we were. It's a very different world we're coming back out into when we come out of lockdown.
So let's explore that a little bit. So your kind of sense where you guys are, what you're thinking in right now is that this is maybe a several year process that we're going to go through of these intermittent shutdowns, openings. Is that your kind of sense?
I don't think it'd be several years, if only because, if all goes well, we'll have a vaccine in that time frame, which will give the immunity, even if people don't catch the virus directly. What I'm thinking more is this year, till the end of this calendar year, is going to be a tricky year. And I think that unless there's a vaccine in place, there'll need to be a continued recognition that we have to take care of ourselves, which will include things like hand washing and so on, but also potentially people not being in as many public places as they might otherwise have been. And we'll see how that kind of plays out and the density of those public places and how that plays out. But that change in consumer behavior will impact some companies. So if you're a cruise operator, if you're an airline, if you're a hotel company, if you're a retailer, this could all impact your business, not to the degree the shutdown does, but it won't necessarily come back all the way to where you would have been in the next 12 months. 2 or 3 years down the track, you may get back, although some trends that are coming out of this pandemic will change business permanently. So I think e-commerce has been growing for a period of time. I think there'll be a step change in e-commerce, which means that some businesses won't come back to the degree that they were. So as I think about scenario planning and working at a board level, it's, okay, we have the optimistic, we have the pessimistic, we have the most likely scenarios for the next 12 to 14 weeks. But then in addition to that, we have, okay, beyond that, we're in an environment where things are not going to be as robust as they were. Real damage has been done to companies' balance sheets. I'll have to repair their balance sheets. Real damage has been done to consumers' balance sheets. So I'll need to repair their balance sheets. The result is you're going to have more saving, less consumption as people repair their balance sheets. And so I think you're likely to have a slower recovery, but a long recovery, kind of like what we had coming out of the Great Recession. And so I think there's an analogy to the recovery between this crisis and that crisis.
When you think about the operational structure processes that companies need to set up, that you're seeing from a board perspective that make them effective in being able to respond and implement through a crisis like that, are you seeing anything, lessons that you'd want to share to listeners about how you either design a team or design a process to make this effective?
That's a good question. If you kind of, let me take a big picture view of this. Companies have been doing enterprise risk management exercises for a period of time. And the insight for me is we've had effectively 3 black swan events over the last 20 years between 9/11, the recession, and now the pandemic. The question is not what is the next enterprise risk management event, but is the company positioned to overcome it, because it's going to come. The increased connectivity around the world means that we tend to move more in a more synchronized way. And as a result of that, I don't know what it'll be, but there'll be something else. And this crisis has been fascinating, as was the Great Recession, because they're both liquidity crises, solvency crises. And yet companies create balance sheets, and we as individuals run our own businesses with balance sheets designed for normal steady state operations. I think what this crisis and a great recession also did will force people to be far more focused and far more conservative on their financing equation, on their funding equation. Liquidity is something nobody thinks about until the day you don't have it, and then it's all you think about. And that's basically what's happening to us now. But in managing this crisis, I think the key is don't worry about the profit and loss statement, don't worry about the balance sheet, focus only on the cash flow statement. If you're in an impacted business, the survival is going to be that cash flow statement. And I've seen my companies really stop talking about P&Ls and balance sheets. So they're showing the board a cash flow statement. And all they're showing us is a cash flow statement because that's all that matters in getting through the crisis. Cash is king. So that's, and get all the liquidity you can wherever you can. Now, I have companies that are all over the place. I have companies that are significantly impacted by this, and I have companies that are getting a tailwind benefit because they're in the consumer staples sector. And so I've got everything happening. So depending upon whether you're impacted or not impacted, I think you do very different things as you go through this crisis.
That's interesting because you've got companies on both sides of this, right? Which is a very interesting spot to be. If you're on the upswing, you're probably pretty thankful right now, but you're also trying to help the community, people, the frontline healthcare workers, and doing anything you can to contribute. And then if you're on the downside, you're looking for help. Are you seeing anybody innovating in any unique ways and saying, hey, things are going to be different. We're going to have to operate differently. Now's the time to switch or do something radically different, or are we still not there yet? It's still in get through the next, 8 weeks planning.
I think at this stage, people are focused on survival to such a degree that they haven't gone to that question yet of what can we do differently, or how do we take advantage of this crisis to come out of this even stronger than we are. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and I think people will start switching to that. But right now, you've had very successful, very large companies having near-death experiences, and so they're just focused on survival. The companies that I work with that are getting a tailwind from this, getting a benefit from this, are just so focused on meeting demand that they are doing everything they can to keep their plants running and keep the people in those plants safe so they can keep operating the basics of the business. The companies that have been impacted are the ones that are having essentially a near-death experience, and they are so radically focused on cash and cutting costs and delaying expenses that they haven't had the time to think about how they change their model when they come out of this crisis.
Do you see any communication cadences or other structures, or if you're running a small business, or you're running not a small business, but you're doing $10 million a year, $3 million a year, how should you be communicating? What's your meeting process? What's your communication pattern? What would you tactically recommend these leaders to do as they go through this kind of really urgent period?
Yeah. So I don't have a lot of exposure directly to how my companies are communicating down in their organizations, but if I talk generically from my experience of working through other crises as a leader, over-communicate. And when you think you're over-communicating, you're probably still not communicating enough. The people's need, desire, requirement for information goes up exponentially in a crisis situation. So you just need to keep communicating on a regular basis until you get to the point where the very idea of getting into another communication thing is just more than you can take. At that point, you're probably barely communicating enough. And you want to use all forms of communication. I have some friends who are CEOs, and they're using video conference calls from their home with 500 people on the video conference call. They're doing obviously emails. They're doing pre-taped video elements online, using every tool available to them to stay in touch with people. And, arguably the smaller the organization, the easier it is to have a personal touch there and actually talk directly to people. But communication, absolutely essential as you go through a crisis like this.
When you're looking at, you said earlier, and I think this is one of the really interesting questions is, you have people say, well, business or education, pick your sector, is going to be radically different after this. The world has changed because of this event. And you have others saying, well, college football might start up in the fall and we kind of, we're not going to keep going again. How do you think about where do you see the changes from this crisis, and what stays the same, what's different?
I think a crisis like this accelerates change. And so I think it is possible to go back and look at similar events like this and say, well, coming out of that event, these things all changed. I think that will happen on this event as well. But I think it's a case of the future is already here today. It's just unevenly distributed, meaning the things that are going to be different going forward, you can already see them today, but then maybe not as evident as they will become. Take the impact on education and distance learning. I think there'll be more of that going forward. It was always there in the past, it just wasn't as widely used. Now we have a situation where the entire population of students is being forced to use it, and educators, and that experience alone, I think, will get some of the bugs out of it, will take some of the fear and mystique out of it, and I think it will increase its usage as we go forward. E-commerce has been on a trend for a while. This event will accelerate it. If you take e-commerce, the penetration is 20, 30, 40% a number of categories. In food, it's only 1 or 2%. So the big change here could be food e-commerce goes through the roof. As people become more comfortable doing it, they see that it works, and it's the effective way to get groceries. So I don't think there's anything that is radically new to the world that happens because of this. But things that are happening anyway suddenly explode because people are forced to use it, and they they get exposed to it, and they see that it works fine, and then they wonder, well, why wasn't I doing that before? And so they just keep doing it. So I do think this is going to create quite a bit of change in our environment, in our society. It's probably change that would have happened anyway, but it gets accelerated into a smaller period of time.
Yeah. So you touched on some interesting points there, especially the food, right? We're all starting to think about how to get food differently, delivered to our house. Do we go to the grocery store? And then you've worked up and down that entire supply chain within the food, which is now probably critical. Maybe more than ever in the past, maybe not. It's always been critical, but can you give any insight there as you see, CPG companies and these food companies, which, if they can't shut down because our food goes away, in the US, we're accustomed to buying things off the shelf and having it at our doorstep. But keeping all your employees safe at a time like this and keeping the operations up is got to be challenging. And do you see massive changes there? Or I'm starting to order some food off of Amazon. It's just,
I think on the food production side, there'll be challenges in terms of keeping people safe and people feeling like, okay, I have to go to work because I'm making food and people depend on me. But I have a relative in my house that if I catch it and I bring it home, my relative could be put in danger. And that just is a very difficult equation for people to get their head around, and how do you solve for that? The beauty of most of the people I've worked with in the food industry is they love being in the food industry. They chose to work in the food industry, and they take a tremendous pride in the fact that they make products that people love to have. When I go through a Kellogg cereal plant, they were intensely proud of the Kellogg brands, and they were intensely proud that they made the food that their kids and their grandkids and everyone ate, and they had tremendous pride in it. So you have a situation right now where they are on the front line. They are the troops that are out there helping us battle this pandemic because they're going every day into harm's way to make food for the rest of us. And I can imagine that sense of camaraderie is actually very powerful in keeping that industry going at this time. Still, there'll be individuals who have unique circumstances that will put them at risk, and I'm sure that the various companies are working with them to how to reduce those risks. But right now, it's every hand to the pump to make that food. Further back in the supply chain, parts of the supply chain are very dependent upon immigrant workers. That will need to get resolved because if the raw materials aren't there, we can't process the food. The other end, the retailing, is where I think we're going to see the biggest change. That's where I think, whether it be direct home delivery or what's called click and pick or curbside delivery, curbside pickup, these are things I could see really growing. In the US, again, only 1 or 2% of sales of food are by e-commerce today. In the UK, it's 15%. In Australia, it's 10 to 15%. In France, it's as high as 20%. And what's happening in those countries, people order online, they go to the store, they don't even get out of their cars. The food's put into the back of the car, they pay for it, and they drive on. That is probably the more cost-effective model for food delivery. And I think we could see that start to explode in the US coming out of this pandemic.
So here's the interesting flip side of that question. So how does the situation change the meaning and the experience of the in-person part of this? So I've started using Instacart. Great, drops off at my doorstep. Everything else, I kind of miss a little bit of the Costco magic treasure hunt where I can go in and sample something new. So how does this change the in-person? Do you see it changing the in-person experience?
You know, it's fascinating. You look at shoppers, grocery shoppers, about 40 or 50% absolutely dislike the whole process. They'd rather not do it at all. And then there's about 40% actually, yeah, this is good fun. I like going down the deli section. I like looking at the different cheeses in the cheese section. I think what you're going to find is the products that are staples, that are very consistent, like a box of cereal, will over-index on home delivery because it's just a logistical experience. How am I going to get to my house? The artisan side, the cheeses, the meats, the fresh fruit and veggies, these are things which is there's variation in the product, and the experience is far more important. And so you could see an environment where the center store categories, which have been under tremendous pressure, are generally the staples and the packaged products that are very consistent in quality. They could get big e-commerce penetration. And your retail store will start looking more like the perimeter of a store today, where it's quite frankly a better experience because retailers have invested more money and effort in that part of their stores. There's more aroma. There's more interaction with the people actually selling the product to you. There could be sampling. And so I think you could see the store becoming more like the perimeter and e-commerce really taking some of the more simple logistical element of the shop out of consumers' hands, or out of the shoppers' hands.
How do you? I think that's really interesting. It heightens the whole aesthetic experience, right? The touch, the feel, the aromas, because you don't need that with toilet paper, but you need that with picking out the right strawberry or the cheese.
Absolutely.
Or whatever. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and if you're a company like Kellogg who spends a lot of money on packaging, on in-store promotions, on display, and suddenly people aren't even walking the aisle to see it, it forces you to rethink your entire model.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of change here for companies long term.
Interesting. So how about one more serious question here, and then Doug can kind of do his rapid fire exercise that I think we'll do. So as you're leading and you're advising a lot of people right now, and you're helping a lot of companies weather the storm here, and you got an army of consultants in your house with you. It sounds like a lot of brain power. How do you want to be thought of on the other side of this as a board member? That how do you want the people you're serving to think about you, and what do you want them to remember, both in the immediate after this is done and then long term? How do you try to be viewed on the other side of this? What would be some things that you're really hoping that people say that you help with?
I think in a crisis, the most important thing for an executive or a board member is to be calm. The last thing you need to do is to add more drama to what's already a difficult environment. So it's a great opportunity to be calm, to be a little bit step back from it. Because when you're an executive, you're in the trenches. You're dealing with this every day. You're making tough decisions to furlough staff. You're making really hard decisions. And as a board member, it's more an element of calm, of we'll get through this, of look, these are tough decisions, but the decisions have to be made, because we don't make these decisions, an even worse outcome happens. So it is an opportunity to be supportive. It's also an opportunity to share best practices across your companies. I'm seeing this somewhere else. Have you ever thought about this? So there's a little bit more interaction right now between me and the management teams that I work with, in part because I'm sharing those best practices. And have you thought about insurance? Most insurance plans don't have, they have exclusions for pandemics, but yet the business interruption plans, is there an argument? So these are the sorts of things that you can do to add value at the edges. In terms of how you want to be remembered, I think the focus is always on how the company succeeds as opposed to how any individual wants to be remembered. But this is an opportunity for calm, fact-based decision-making, facing the reality that we have and recognizing that this too shall pass.
Those are great lessons, and the experience you have not only leading a great company, but then sitting on a board is I know informative for all of us. We've got. Have you seen Inside the Actor Studio, John?
I have not.
Okay, Inside the Actor Studio. It was a nice little show. I can't remember what it was on, but one of those artsy channels, and they had all these. He would give these rapid fire questions to his guests, very simple one word answers. So I thought we will do that with you here today. So I got 5 or 6 here. So are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay. Favorite leader?
Winston Churchill.
Courage or compassion?
Courage.
Speed or accuracy?
Speed.
Liking or respect?
Respect.
Great ideas or great execution?
Great execution.
One word to describe your leadership style?
That's hard. The first word that came to mind was empathetic, but I'm not sure that everyone would agree with me on that. So I'll go with that one anyway.
Okay, good. And then to close out, if you had a spirit animal that would really illustrate your leadership style, what would be your spirit animal?
I'd like it to be an owl. I suspect it might be a jackass. I don't know.
Wonderful. Well,
any last people, where do you get inspiration from, John? That's one I want to ask. And then any great books you think people should be reading now or anytime? One book or
inspiration comes from everybody around you. I remember when 9/11 happened, I saw my next door neighbor and she was in tears because she was concerned her children would be sent off to war. Inspiration is something that I actually find most just by talking to people, no matter who they are, what roles they have. In terms of great books, actually, I just finished Winston Churchill, which is one of the reasons I probably mentioned Winston Churchill. 52 hours of audiobook. So it's a major commitment if you do it through audiobook.
Good. Perfect. Thank you, John, so much for joining us on the podcast.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Great to have you.